a teenage boy, and his armor-bearer climbed a cliff to attack an entire Philistine garrison, and God turned it into a national victory. Let me tell you about Jonathan's crazy faith that saved Israel. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today I want to tell you about one of the most audacious acts of faith in the entire Bible. It's the story of Jonathan, the son of King Saul, and how he took on an entire enemy army with just one companion. This isn't a story about military strategy or superior weapons. This is a story about radical faith, about taking action when everyone else is paralyzed by fear, and about how God can use the bold obedience of one person to save an entire nation. Let me walk you through what happened. To understand this story, we need to know the situation Israel was in. The Philistines were Israel's greatest enemy at this time. They were technologically superior, with advanced weapons and armor. The Philistines had a monopoly on iron, which meant they controlled the production of weapons. Israelite farmers had to go to the Philistines just to sharpen their plows and tools, and the Philistines charged outrageous prices for it. The Bible tells us that when it came time for battle, there was not a sword or spear to be found in the hands of any of the Israelite soldiers. Only King Saul and his son Jonathan had proper weapons. Think about that. An entire army with no swords or spears. They were fighting with farm tools and whatever makeshift weapons they could find. The Philistines had assembled a massive army. The Bible describes it as soldiers, as numerous as the sand on the seashore. 3,000 chariots, 6,000 charioteers, and soldiers too many to count. They set up camp at Michmash, ready to crush Israel. When the Israelite soldiers saw the size of the Philistine army, they panicked. They started hiding in caves, in thickets, among rocks, in pits and cisterns. Some even crossed the Jordan River to escape. King Saul had started with an army of 3,000 men. By the time we get to this story, he was down to 600. And those 600 were trembling with fear. Saul was camped under a pomegranate tree, essentially doing nothing. The Philistines were sending out raiding parties to destroy Israelite towns and crops. Israel was being systematically destroyed, and their king was paralyzed. But Saul's son Jonathan was different. Jonathan was probably a teenager or in his early 20s. He was young, bold, and full of faith. While his father sat under a tree, Jonathan decided to do something. One day Jonathan said to his young armor-bearer, "Come, let's go over to the Philistine outpost on the other side." But he did not tell his father. Notice that. He didn't ask permission. He didn't call a council meeting. He didn't wait for his father to come up with a plan. He just took action. Jonathan and his armor-bearer left the camp without telling anyone. They were going to attack a Philistine garrison. Just the two of them, against an entire military outpost. This sounds insane, and by human logic, it was. But Jonathan wasn't operating on human logic. He was operating on faith. As they approached the Philistine position, Jonathan said to his armor-bearer, "Come, let's go over to the outpost of those uncircumcised men. Perhaps the Lord will act in our behalf. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few." Read that again. Perhaps the Lord will act. Jonathan didn't have a guarantee. He didn't have a prophecy or a promise. He just had faith that God could work through him. And he understood a crucial truth. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few. God doesn't need a large army. He doesn't need superior weapons. He just needs people who will step out in faith. Jonathan's armor-bearer replied, "Do all that you have in mind. Go ahead. I am with you heart and soul." This young man, whose name we don't even know, was willing to follow Jonathan into this impossible situation. Jonathan then laid out a plan. He said, "We will cross over toward them and let them see us. If they say to us, 'Wait there until we come to you,' we will stay where we are. But if they say, 'Come up to us,' we will climb up, because that will be our sign that the Lord has given them into our hands." Jonathan was looking for a sign from God, not because he doubted, but because he wanted confirmation that this was God's moment to act. So the two of them showed themselves to the Philistine outpost. The Philistines saw them and shouted, "Look, the Hebrews are crawling out of the holes they were hiding in." Then the soldiers called down to Jonathan and his armor-bearer, "Come up to us, and we'll teach you a lesson." That was the sign Jonathan was looking for. He said to his armor-bearer, "Climb up after me. The Lord has given them into the hand of Israel." Now picture this. Jonathan and his armor-bearer had to climb up a cliff on their hands and knees. They were completely vulnerable. If the Philistines had rained down arrows or rocks, they would have been killed easily. But they climbed anyway. When they reached the top, Jonathan attacked. The Bible says Jonathan and his armor-bearer struck down about 20 men in an area of about half an acre. 20 trained Philistine soldiers killed by 2 young men. But what happened next was even more remarkable. Panic struck the whole Philistine army. It spread through the camp and to the raiding parties. Even the ground shook. It was a panic sent by God. The Philistine soldiers started attacking each other in the confusion. They didn't know who was friend or foe. Complete chaos. Back at the Israelite camp, Saul's lookouts saw the Philistine army melting away in all directions. Saul finally realized something was happening and ordered a roll call. That's when they discovered Jonathan and his armor-bearer were missing. The Israelites who had been hiding in the hills heard that the Philistines were on the run. They came out and joined the pursuit. Even the Hebrews who had defected to the Philistine side switched back. What started with 2 young men attacking a garrison ended with the entire Philistine army in retreat. The Bible says, "So on that day, the Lord saved Israel." God used Jonathan's bold faith to deliver the entire nation. One teenager's act of courage sparked a chain reaction that led to national victory. Now, there's an unfortunate ending to this story that we need to address. In his eagerness, King Saul made a foolish oath that day. He said no one could eat until evening, until he had avenged himself on his enemies. Jonathan, who was out fighting and didn't hear the oath, ate some honey to regain his strength. When Saul found out, he was going to execute Jonathan for breaking the oath. The people had to intervene and save Jonathan's life. Even in victory, Saul's poor leadership nearly cost Israel their hero. But here's what we learn from Jonathan's story. First, God can use the few to save the many. You don't need to wait until you have massive resources or support. If God is with you, you are the majority. Second, sometimes you have to act even when others won't. Saul sat under a tree while the nation was being destroyed. Jonathan took action. Third, look for God's confirmation. But don't let fear paralyze you. Jonathan looked for a sign, but he was already moving toward the battle. He wasn't using waiting for confirmation as an excuse to do nothing. Fourth, bold faith inspires others. Jonathan's courage inspired his armor-bearer, then the hiding soldiers, then the whole nation. One person's faith can spark a movement. Fifth, God fights for those who step out in faith. Jonathan didn't defeat the Philistines alone. God sent panic and confusion into the enemy camp. God did the heavy lifting, but Jonathan had to take the first step. Finally, age and experience aren't everything. Jonathan was young, probably a teenager. His father was the king with decades of experience. But Jonathan had something Saul lacked: faith and courage. God doesn't call the qualified, He qualifies the called. So what's your impossible situation? What enemy are you facing that seems too big to overcome? What is God calling you to do that everyone else thinks is crazy? Maybe it's time to stop waiting for perfect conditions. Stop waiting for more resources. Stop waiting for permission and just climb the cliff. Because nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few. And He's looking for people who will act on that truth. If this story encouraged you, please hit that like button. It helps more people discover these incredible biblical accounts. Leave a comment below and tell me, what's one area where you need Jonathan's kind of bold faith? And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.